Did you know that over 2,000 truckers go missing each year in the United States, with many cases remaining unsolved? The open road, vast and lonely, can be as dangerous as it is liberating. Tonight, we'll delve into some of the most chilling encounters experienced by truckers, stories of isolation, fear, and the unknown that will make you think twice about what lurks in the shadows on those long, empty highways. Story 1. The Midnight Hitchhiker. I was driving through the flat, barren landscape of New Mexico late one night. The road was empty, stretching on for miles with nothing but the dim glow of my headlights illuminating the way. It was one of those nights where the darkness feels thicker, like it's closing in on you. I'd been driving for hours, fighting off the exhaustion that comes with long-haul trucking. The CB radio had gone silent hours ago, leaving me alone with just the hum of the engine. That's when I saw him. A man was standing on the side of the road, thumbing for a ride. He was tall, with a gaunt face and hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through the night. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers, especially not in the middle of nowhere at this hour, but something about this guy made me slow down. Maybe it was the way he was dressed, a clean, white shirt and jeans that looked out of place in the middle of the desert. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. The guy climbed into the cab, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were conserving energy. He didn't say much at first, just a nod of thanks. We drove in silence for a while, the tension in the cab growing thicker with each passing mile. I tried to make small talk, asking where he was headed. He just pointed down the road and said, "Just keep driving." His voice was flat, almost mechanical. I figured he might be running from something or someone, so I didn't push for more. But after a while, I couldn't take the silence anymore. I asked him again where he needed to go. This time, he turned his head slowly to look at me, his hollow eyes locking onto mine. "You'll know when we get there," he said in that same monotone voice. A shiver ran down my spine. I felt a cold sweat forming on my brow. The guy didn't seem right, like he was in some kind of trance. I started to regret picking him up, but it was too late now. We were in the middle of nowhere, and there was no turning back. After what felt like an eternity, he suddenly said, "Stop here." I hit the brakes, the truck coming to a screeching halt. We were in the middle of the desert, no signs of life for miles. I looked around, confused. There was nothing out there but sand and darkness. The man opened the door and got out, standing there for a moment, staring into the void. Then he turned back to me, a strange smile playing on his lips. "Thanks for the ride," he said, his voice sounding almost human this time. Without another word, he walked off into the darkness, disappearing from sight within seconds. I waited, half expecting him to come back, but he never did. After a few minutes, I slammed the door shut and floored the gas, desperate to put as much distance between me and that spot as possible. When I reached the next truck stop, I asked around if anyone had seen a hitchhiker out there. The locals just stared at me like I was crazy. "Ain't nobody out there at night. Not for miles," one of them said. "You must have imagined it." But I knew what I saw. I still wonder who, or what, that man was, and why he was out there in the middle of the desert. But the part that keeps me up at night, I never saw his reflection in the rearview mirror. Story 2. The Rest Stop. It was around 2 a.m., and I was dead tired. I'd been driving for close to 14 hours, and my eyes felt like they were full of sand. I knew I had to stop, so when I saw the sign for a rest area coming up, I figured I'd pull in, catch a couple hours of sleep, and get back on the road. The rest stop was one of those older ones, not much more than a few parking spots and a couple of vending machines. It was empty except for a lone sedan parked near the restrooms. I pulled in a bit further away, not wanting to be disturbed by anyone coming or going. I killed the engine and reclined my seat, letting out a long sigh. The silence was comforting at first, a welcome change from the constant roar of the highway. I started to drift off, but something woke me up, a faint sound, like someone shuffling around outside the truck. I sat up, peering out the windows. At first, I didn't see anything, just the empty lot bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the streetlights. But then I spotted him, a man standing near the vending machines, just staring at my truck. He was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes that made him blend into the shadows. I couldn't make out his face, but I could feel his eyes on me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself he was just another traveler, maybe deciding on a snack. But the longer I sat there, the more uneasy I felt. The guy wasn't moving, just standing there, staring. I thought about starting the truck and driving off, but I was too tired. I told myself to ignore him, to close my eyes and go back to sleep. But when I leaned back, I heard it, the soft, almost imperceptible sound of footsteps coming closer. My heart started to race. I sat up again, and the guy was gone. I scanned the lot, but there was no sign of him. Just as I was about to relax, I heard a faint tap on the passenger side window. I jumped, my pulse pounding in my ears. I turned slowly, dread filling my stomach. There he was, his face pressed up against the glass, staring right at me. His eyes were wide, almost manic, and he was grinning, showing too many teeth. I scrambled for the keys, my hands shaking as I fumbled to start the engine. The guy didn't move, just kept staring and grinning, his breath fogging up the glass. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I threw the truck into gear, peeling out of the rest stop as fast as I could. In my rearview mirror, I saw him standing in the middle of the road, watching me leave, his grin still wide, his eyes following me until I was out of sight. I didn't stop again until I reached the next town. My nerves shot. I've stopped at hundreds of rest areas over the years, but I've never forgotten that night. I don't know what that guy wanted, and I sure as hell didn't want to find out. Now, whenever I pull into a rest stop, I can't help but scan the shadows, half expecting to see that grinning face staring back at me. Story 3. The Vanishing Convoy. A few years back, I was running a long haul from Oregon down to Arizona. I was part of a convoy. A few of us truckers decided to stick together for the trip since the weather was supposed to get nasty in the mountains. We were all communicating through our CB radios, chatting and keeping each other awake as the miles rolled by. There were 4 of us in total, all hauling different loads but headed in the same direction. The lead truck was driven by a guy named Jim, a seasoned driver who'd been on the road for decades. As we started climbing into the mountains, the weather turned as predicted. Thick fog rolled in, making visibility drop to near zero. We slowed down, our radios filled with the static of crackling voices as we tried to keep track of each other in the murk. That's when things got strange. Jim was leading, and I was bringing up the rear. We'd been driving through the fog for about an hour when Jim's voice crackled over the radio, sounding tense. "Hey, you guys seeing this? There's another convoy up ahead." I squinted through the windshield, but all I saw was fog. "What are you talking about, Jim? There's no one out here but us." "No, I swear. There's a line of trucks up ahead," he insisted. "Same as us, for trucks, same formation." The other drivers chimed in, saying they couldn't see anything either. But Jim was adamant. "They're there. I'm telling you. They're matching our speed exactly. It's like they're following us." We all fell silent, the only sound the hiss of static and the rumble of our engines. I strained my eyes, trying to pierce the fog, but I saw nothing. Just the faint glow of Jim's taillights up ahead. After a few minutes, Jim's voice came back on, quieter this time. "They're gone." "Who's gone?" I asked. "The trucks," Jim replied, his voice shaky. "They just vanished." None of us knew what to say. We drove in silence for a while, the tension thick in the air. Eventually, the fog started to lift, and we all breathed a little easier. But Jim didn't say another word for the rest of the trip. When we finally reached our destination, we all pulled into the same truck stop, eager to talk about what had happened. But when I went to find Jim, his truck was gone. I asked the other drivers, but none of them had seen him leave. I tried calling him on the radio, but there was no response. It was like he'd just disappeared. I never saw Jim again, and no one I talked to could tell me what happened to him. It's like he and his truck just vanished into the fog, along with that phantom convoy. Story 4. The Woman on the Bridge. I was driving through West Virginia, taking a shortcut through the back roads to avoid some heavy traffic on the interstate. It was late, probably around 1 a.m., and the road was winding through dense woods. The trees loomed over the road, their branches almost touching in the middle, creating a tunnel of darkness. As I rounded a curve, I saw a bridge up ahead. It was one of those old, single-lane steel bridges, the kind you don't see much anymore. The headlights hit it just right, and that's when I saw her. A woman standing right in the middle of the bridge. She was wearing a long, white dress, and her hair was hanging loose, covering most of her face. She wasn't moving, just standing there, staring down at the water below. I slowed down, not sure what to do. I couldn't just drive past her. It was a narrow bridge, and she was standing right in the middle. I honked the horn, but she didn't react. She just kept standing there, like she didn't even hear it. Something about the way she was standing there, so still, in the dead of night, made my skin crawl. I rolled down the window and called out to her, asking if she needed help. No response. She didn't even look up. My mind was racing. Should I get out and check on her? But something deep down told me not to. There was something off about her, something that didn't feel right. Finally, I decided to try and go around her. I pulled the truck as far to the side as I could, the tires scraping against the edge of the bridge. As I inched forward, the headlights caught her face just right, and I saw her eyes. They were wide and empty, staring right through me, like she was looking at something far away. But it wasn't just that. They were filled with something that looked like pure fear. That's when she moved. Not much, just a slight tilt of her head, like she was listening to something. I didn't stick around to find out what it was. I gunned the engine and sped across the bridge, the trailer rattling as I bounced over the old steel planks. When I reached the other side, I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see her still standing there. But she was gone. Just like that. I didn't stop driving until I reached a truck stop about 30 miles down the road. I was shaking, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I don't know what that woman was doing out there or why she was on that bridge in the middle of the night, but I haven't taken that shortcut since. Story 5. The Long Stretch. There's a stretch of highway out in Nevada that's infamous among truckers. It's a long, desolate road that cuts through the desert for miles with no towns, no gas stations, just emptiness. It's the kind of road that messes with your head after a while, makes you see things. I was hauling a load of electronics, trying to make it to the next town before dawn. The road was pitch black, the only light coming from my headlights and the pale sliver of moon above. It was the kind of night where everything feels heavier, where the silence presses down on you. I'd been driving for hours without seeing another soul, just mile after mile of blacktop stretching into the darkness. The monotony was getting to me, my eyelids drooping, my mind starting to wander. That's when I saw the lights. They were faint at first, just a pair of dim headlights in the distance, far behind me. I figured it was another trucker, finally some company on this lonely road. But as the minutes passed, the lights didn't seem to get any closer. They just stayed there, hovering in the distance. I kept driving, but the lights never changed, always staying the same distance behind me, like they were following me, but not gaining. It was unnerving. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just another driver keeping a safe distance. But then, out of nowhere, my radio crackled to life. A voice came through, low and distorted, like it was being dragged through static. "You shouldn't be out here." I grabbed the mic, my heart racing. "Who is this?" No response, just more static. I tried again, but the radio stayed silent. I glanced in the mirror, and the lights were still there, still the same distance away, like they were tethered to me. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the radio came back on. The same voice, still distorted, but this time it was clearer. "You need to stop. Now." My blood ran cold. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to stop, not out here in the middle of nowhere, but something in that voice, the way it sounded so urgent, so certain, made me hesitate. Before I could decide, the lights behind me suddenly flared, bright and blinding. They were right on me now, closing in fast. I swerved, almost losing control as the lights filled the cab, blinding me. And then, just like that, they were gone. I hit the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt in the middle of the road. I sat there, my heart pounding, my hands shaking on the wheel. There was nothing behind me, just darkness. No lights, no other vehicles, nothing. I don't know how long I sat there before I finally started driving again, but when I did, I didn't stop until I reached the next town. I checked the truck, the road, everything, but there was no sign of what had happened. No explanation for those lights or the voice on the radio. I've driven that stretch of highway a few times since, but I've never seen those lights again. Still, every time I'm out there, I can't shake the feeling that something's watching me, waiting for the right moment to reappear. Story 6. The Man in the Rain. It was pouring down, one of those relentless storms that turns everything into a blur of gray. I was hauling a load through the backroads of Kentucky, trying to avoid the interstate traffic. The rain was so heavy that my wipers could barely keep up, and the road ahead was just a shimmering ribbon in the darkness. I'd been driving for hours without seeing another vehicle. It was just me, the storm, and the endless road. The isolation was starting to get to me, the pounding rain drumming out any thoughts that tried to form. That's when I saw him. There was a man standing on the side of the road, drenched to the bone, his thumb out for a ride. He was barely visible through the rain, just a dark figure outlined by the faint glow of my headlights. At first, I thought he was some poor soul whose car had broken down, but as I got closer, something felt off. His clothes were too thin for the weather, just a light jacket and jeans, completely soaked. And there was something about the way he stood there, motionless, even as my truck approached. Most people would back up, maybe wave me down more frantically, but he just stood there, staring straight ahead. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and rolled down the window, rain splattering into the cab. "You need a ride?" I called out. He didn't respond, just turned his head slowly to look at me. His eyes were dark, almost empty, like there was nothing behind them. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt a sudden urge to get out of there, but something kept me rooted in place. Finally, he nodded, just once, and started to walk toward the truck. But as he did, I noticed something strange. His movements were stiff, jerky, like he was struggling to make his body do what he wanted. He reached the door and stood there for a moment, his hand hovering over the handle. That's when I noticed the smell. Something faint but unmistakable, like wet earth and decay. My instinct screamed at me to hit the gas, to get away from this man, but I was frozen, my hand gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles were white. He opened the door and climbed in, water pooling around his feet. I could barely look at him, that smell growing stronger now that he was inside. I started to drive, the silence in the cab thick and oppressive. We hadn't gone more than a mile when he finally spoke. "You should have kept driving." His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it cut through the sound of the rain like a knife. I glanced over at him, but his face was turned away, staring out the window. I didn't know what to say, my mind racing with all the reasons I shouldn't have stopped. After a few minutes, he spoke again, this time more urgently. "You need to let me out." I didn't argue. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands trembling as I reached for the door. But before I could unlock it, he did something I'll never forget. He turned to me, his eyes wide and panicked, and grabbed my arm. His grip was ice cold, and his fingers dug into my skin. "Don't stop for anyone else," he said, his voice trembling. "Just keep driving." Then he let go and opened the door, stumbling out into the rain. I didn't wait to see where he went. I slammed the door shut and hit the gas, the truck fishtailing on the wet road as I sped away. I didn't stop until I reached a truck stop a few towns over. My hands were still shaking as I parked and got out, the rain now just a light drizzle. I looked down at my arm where he'd grabbed me, and there was a bruise already forming, dark and angry. I've picked up a few hitchhikers over the years, but I've never forgotten that man in the rain, and I've never stopped for anyone in a storm since. Story 7. The Abandoned Rest Area. It was somewhere in the Midwest, one of those long stretches of highway where the scenery never changes and the miles blur together. I was running late on a delivery, so I hadn't planned on stopping, but after hours of driving, the exhaustion hit me like a brick wall. I needed a break, just a few minutes to stretch my legs and clear my head. That's when I saw the sign for a rest area coming up. It was one of those older ones that hadn't been updated in decades, the kind with peeling paint and cracked pavement. But I didn't care. I just needed a place to pull over. I took the exit and drove down the narrow road that led to the rest area. As I pulled in, I noticed it was completely deserted. No other cars, no signs of life. The place looked abandoned, with weeds growing through the cracks in the asphalt and the buildings covered in graffiti. I parked the truck and got out, the quietness of the place unnerving after the constant hum of the highway. I stretched, feeling the stiffness in my back, and looked around. The restrooms were boarded up, the vending machines long since empty. The whole place had an eerie, forgotten feel to it. I walked around a bit, trying to shake off the unease that was creeping up on me. There was a small path leading into the woods behind the rest area, and I thought about taking a short walk to wake myself up. But as I got closer, I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. There were footprints in the dirt, fresh ones, leading from the path toward the restrooms. They were big, too big to belong to a regular person, more like something an animal would leave behind. But they weren't animal tracks, they were human, just wrong. I felt a chill run down my spine. I wasn't alone out here. I quickly turned back to the truck, my pace quickening as I tried to push the growing fear out of my mind. But then I heard it, a soft rustling coming from the woods, like something moving through the underbrush. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was right at the edge of the trees. I strained my eyes, trying to see what was there, but the shadows were too thick. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the rustling stopped. The silence was deafening, the air thick with tension. I didn't wait to find out what was out there. I bolted for the truck, my footsteps echoing in the empty lot. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. I glanced in the mirrors, half expecting to see something emerge from the woods, but there was nothing, just the dark trees and the abandoned rest area. I floored it, speeding out of there as fast as I could. As I merged back onto the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly avoided something terrible. I don't know what was in those woods, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I've never stopped at an abandoned rest area since. Story 8. The Wrong Turn. I was driving through the backroads of Texas, trying to shave some time off my route. It was late, close to midnight, and the only light came from my headlights cutting through the darkness. I'd taken a wrong turn a few miles back, but the GPS was recalculating, so I figured I'd just follow the road until I could get back on track. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for my rig, and the trees pressed in on both sides, their branches forming a canopy overhead. It felt like I was driving through a tunnel, the darkness almost suffocating. As I rounded a bend, I saw something up ahead that made my stomach drop. There was a car sitting in the middle of the road, its hazard lights blinking. I slowed down, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The car was old, beaten up, and looked like it hadn't been driven in years. But that wasn't what bothered me. It was the fact that the car was perfectly positioned to block the road, with no sign of anyone around. I stopped the truck a few feet away, my headlights illuminating the car. I honked the horn, hoping someone would come out, but there was no response. I leaned out the window, calling out, but the only answer was the echo of my voice. Something wasn't right. My instincts were screaming at me to turn around, but there was no room to maneuver the truck on the narrow road. I was stuck. I decided to get out and take a closer look, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the cool night air. The silence was oppressive, the kind that makes you feel like you're being watched. I approached the car cautiously, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. As I got closer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were scratches on the car's hood and roof, deep gouges that looked like they'd been made by something with claws. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was it an animal? A bear, maybe? But there were no bears in this part of Texas. I shone the light into the car's interior, but it was empty, just an old, tattered seat and a cracked dashboard. That's when I heard it, a soft rustling sound coming from the woods beside the road. It was faint at first, but it quickly grew louder, closer. My pulse quickened, and I backed away from the car, my eyes darting to the tree line. And then I saw it, a pair of eyes, glowing in the darkness, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. They were low to the ground, too low to belong to a person. Whatever it was watching me, waiting. I didn't stick around to find out what it was. I sprinted back to the truck, my heart pounding in my ears. I jumped in, locked the doors, and threw the truck into reverse. The tires spun on the gravel, but I managed to get the rig moving, backing up until I found a spot wide enough to turn around. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, but the road was empty. The car, the eyes, everything was gone. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on the main highway. I still don't know what I saw that night, and I'm not sure I want to. All I know is that I'll never take a wrong turn in the middle of nowhere again. Story 9. The Empty Gas Station. I was on a long haul through Arizona, miles of desert stretching out in every direction. The sun had set hours ago, leaving the world around me bathed in darkness. My fuel gauge was dipping lower than I liked, so I started keeping an eye out for a gas station. Finally, I saw a sign for one a few miles ahead. It was an old, faded sign, the kind that's been standing there for decades, but it was the only option, so I took the exit. The road was narrow and bumpy, leading me farther into the desert. After a few miles, I saw the gas station up ahead. It was a small, run-down place, with a single pump out front and a flickering neon sign that said, "Open." I pulled in, relieved to have found it, and parked by the pump. The place was eerily quiet, not a single car in sight. The windows of the station were dark, but the "Open" sign was still on, so I figured someone had to be inside. I got out of the truck, the dry desert air hitting me as I walked toward the door. I tried the handle, but the door was locked. I knocked, but there was no answer. I knocked again, harder this time, and finally, I heard footsteps from inside. A moment later, the door creaked open, and an old man appeared. He was hunched over, his face lined with deep wrinkles, and his eyes were hidden behind thick glasses. He stared at me for a moment before speaking. "What do you need?" His voice was gravelly, like he hadn't used it in a long time. "Just need some fuel," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "The pump's not working." He nodded slowly and stepped back inside. I waited, feeling uneasy as the seconds ticked by. Finally, the lights flickered on, casting a dim glow over the dusty interior. "Try it now," the old man called from inside. I walked back to the pump and lifted the nozzle. The pump roared to life, and I started filling up the tank, the unease growing with each passing second. The whole place felt wrong, like it was stuck in time, abandoned but still functioning. As I waited for the tank to fill, I glanced around. That's when I noticed something strange. The windows of the station were covered in dust and grime, but there were handprints on the glass, small, child-sized handprints pressed against the inside of the glass. A chill ran down my spine. Why would there be children out here, in the middle of nowhere? And why did the handprints look so fresh? I finished fueling up as quickly as I could, my nerves on edge. I wanted to get out of there, but something made me glance back at the station one last time. The old man was standing by the door, watching me with those hidden eyes. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, just barely visible in the dim light, were two small figures, a boy and a girl, their faces pale and expressionless, staring at me through the dirty glass. I didn't wait. I jumped back in the truck, started the engine, and sped away from that gas station as fast as I could. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was miles down the road, the desert stretching out in all directions. To this day, I don't know what I saw at that gas station. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the fatigue and the isolation getting to me. But I've never been able to shake the image of those small handprints on the glass, or the feeling that I wasn't alone out there in the desert. Last story, The Hitchhiker's Warning. I was driving through the Appalachian Mountains, one of those winding, twisting roads that seems to go on forever. It was the middle of the night, and I hadn't seen another car for hours. The fog had rolled in thick, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. I was rounding a particularly sharp curve when I saw him, a man standing on the side of the road, his thumb out, asking for a ride. He was young, maybe in his early 20s, wearing a backpack and a rain-soaked jacket. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers, but something about the way he was standing there, alone in the fog, made me slow down. I rolled down the window and called out to him. "Where are you headed?" He stepped closer, his face pale and tired. "Just need a lift to the next town," he said. "I've been walking for hours." I hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "Hop in." He climbed into the passenger seat, dropping his backpack at his feet. As soon as he was inside, I felt a strange tension in the air, like something wasn't quite right. But I shook it off and started driving. For the first few miles, we didn't talk much. He seemed nervous, constantly glancing out the window, his fingers tapping on his knee. Finally, I broke the silence. "Where are you coming from?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "Just passing through. Got lost on one of the trails." That didn't sound right. The trails around here were well marked, and it was hard to get lost unless you were really off the beaten path. But I didn't press him. A few minutes later, he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "You need to be careful on this road." I glanced over at him, confused. "What do you mean?" He swallowed, his eyes fixed on the fog outside. "There's something out here, something that follows people. It watches you, waits until you're alone, then." He trailed off, his words hanging in the air. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I tried to laugh it off. "Sounds like you've been watching too many horror movies." But he didn't smile. "I'm serious," he said, his voice trembling. "I've seen it. It looks like a person, but it's not. It hides in the fog, just out of sight. You think you're alone, but it's there, watching you." I didn't know what to say. The fear in his voice was real, and it was starting to get to me. I kept my eyes on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was out there, hidden in the thick fog. We drove in silence for a while longer, the tension in the cab growing with each passing mile. Finally, the fog started to lift, and the lights of a small town appeared in the distance. "There's my stop," the hitchhiker said, relief in his voice. I pulled over at the edge of town, and he climbed out, grabbing his backpack. Before he closed the door, he looked back at me, his face serious. "Don't stop for anyone else on this road," he warned. "No matter what you see." I nodded, my mouth dry. "Take care." He closed the door, and I watched as he disappeared into the darkness, his figure swallowed by the night. I didn't stay long. As soon as he was out of sight, I hit the gas and drove straight through the town, not stopping until I was miles away. I don't know if the hitchhiker was telling the truth, or if he was just paranoid after spending too much time alone in the mountains. But I do know that I didn't stop for anyone else that night, and I haven't since. These stories remind us of the dangers lurking in the most unexpected places, on lonely highways, at deserted rest stops, and in the shadows of the night. For every trucker who has had a brush with the unknown, there are countless others who have vanished without a trace. The fear that accompanies these real-life encounters lingers long after the journey ends, leaving us with a deep unease about the darkness we cannot see. If these stories gave you chills, remember that there are countless more out there. Stay alert on the road, trust your instincts, and if you've experienced something strange yourself, don't keep it to yourself, share your story, because you never know who might need to hear it.